Hi, and welcome to Caterpillar Cross Stitch. My name is Ford, and this week we're going to be talking about what's known as the English method of cross stitch. We're going to talk about what it is, how it's done, and why you might choose it sometimes. If you've learned anything from any of my videos, I'm going to ask you right now to take just a moment, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and when we're done, leave me a comment down below. That doesn't really cost you anything other than a few seconds of time, but it makes a really big difference for me. So I would appreciate it if you take just a moment and do that. So what is the English method? Well, there are basically two primary ways of completing a cross stitch. And one I talked about recently, the Danish method. The English method is the other way of doing it, where instead of doing half of each stitch in a row or in a group or a cluster of stitches, you complete each stitch one at a time. And there are pros and cons to doing it both ways, but let me show you first just how an English method is done. So I've got my thread started here, and I used the loop start there. And now normally, because I'm generally a Danish method stitcher, I would do my next stitch. I would do this half stitch, and I would continue on along that row for however many stitches are there. But if I'm choosing to use English method rather than doing that, what I would do is I would go ahead and complete this cross stitch. And then I would start the next cross stitch. And this is the way that a lot of people were taught to do it, and for a lot of people it feels a little bit more intuitive. So I'm going to do a handful of stitches here so that I can demonstrate to you some of the ways that this is different in the finished product. Now while I'm doing that, I want to take just a second right now and remind you to join the Caterpillar Cross Stitch Stitch Club email. You'll get all the latest news about upcoming products, retreats, stitch-alongs, those sorts of things that Caterpillar is coming out with. Plus, as soon as you sign up, you'll get a download with 9 free PDF cross-stitch patterns, including a year-long temperature tracker pattern. So hit the link down there in the description so you can be up to date with all the latest cross-stitch news in addition to those great perks. So now that I've got a few stitches finished there, let me show you one big difference that will be immediately noticeable. And that is how these stitches look on the back. If you'll notice here, rather than the little row of vertical lines that I get when I do a Danish method, with an English method I wind up with one vertical stitch and one diagonal stitch. I get this kind of little zigzag thing that runs across the back of the project. And a lot of people talk about Danish method using less floss, and technically that is true. But there are a couple of differences that kind of mitigate how much that matters, and the difference in floss usage really doesn't turn out to be that much. But if you think about it, when you're working on the back of when your thread is traveling on the back of the project, what I'm going to refer to as the return stitch from now on, when it goes straight up one stitch, that's a distance of 1. I'm going to call that 1 stitch length. When it goes diagonally from corner to corner, that's going to be a distance of square root of 2 stitch length, so about 1.4. So on the front, we're always doing diagonals, so that's 1.4 plus 1.4. And on the back, when we're using Danish method, it's 1 and 1. So we wind up with a total stitch length of about 4.8 per stitch. Whereas if we use the English method, we get 3 diagonal stitches and 1 vertical stitch per stitch. So it's instead of about 4.8, it's about 5.2 stitch lengths per stitch. So it theoretically can make a little bit of a difference, but in my experience, the floss usage difference is negligible. Real quick, if you're not in a cross-stitch centric space, you're missing out on the benefit of so much experience and wisdom. Make sure that you join the Caterpillar Cross Stitch Facebook group and follow the Caterpillar Cross Stitch Instagram. There's an amazing community in there, and if you're not taking advantage of it, you're really missing out. So under what circumstances might you choose to use English method instead of Danish method? Well, the first one that springs to mind would be what we call confetti stitches or travel stitches. When you have a single stitch that is somewhere off, either among other stitches or off in unstitched areas of the fabric that doesn't have any other stitches of the same color surrounding it. If you were using the Danish method, you would go to that stitch and then you'd go way over to the next one, and then you'd have to come back to cross those stitches. So you'd be running across the back of the fabric twice as much. So when you're doing those kinds of stitches, if you're traveling over to them with the thread on the back of the project, you're going to want to complete each stitch as you get to them. That one seems pretty straightforward. Another time when I will frequently choose to use the English method is when doing a vertical column of stitches. The Danish method doesn't work super great for vertical columns of stitches just because of the path that the thread has to take. So you get a slightly neater stitch and a little bit less floss usage if you use the English method for a direct vertical column of stitches. Another time that you might choose to use the English method is if it makes more sense for the path that your thread needs to take. I frequently will kind of think about what path I'm going to choose to follow through the project. So I know that when I'm using the Danish method, my thread is going to start and stop in the same place. So I'm going to go from left to right, and then I'm going to go from right to left, and my thread will wind up right where I started. So I can take that into account when I'm doing, say, text in a project. If I go and do this letter, I know that I will wind up back between them. So I'll kind of start in the middle of a couple of letters or whatever. With the English method, you're going to start in one place and end up in another place altogether. So this can be really useful for allowing a more efficient use of your floss without having to cut and start. So if you have a few stitches that kind of bridge the gap between two large areas, frequently the smart thing to do is to start on the inside edge of one of them, go over, come back, go over, do those few stitches in the middle, and then go over and then come back, and because you'll wind up right where you started. So this is kind of an advanced thing that allows you to think about where you're starting and where you're stopping so you don't have to cut your floss as many times. Keeps you stitching, keeps you efficient. Another time when I will always use English method is if I am working with variegated floss. Check out my video about getting the best results out of variegated floss, and you'll see why that is the case. But basically, if you go down and then come back, the floss color change kind of gets canceled out. And so if your floss, for instance, is changing from purple to yellow, when you go down, it might be purple, and when you come back, it might be yellow. So now you've got a purple half stitch, and you're crossing that with a yellow half stitch. And so it kind of undoes the beauty of that variegated floss. So using the English method there is a very common recommendation. And in preparation for this video, I was frogging all of the stitches that I had done on this piece of scrap fabric in a previous video. And I'd done some English method stitches on there. And I noticed that the English method stitches that I had done were much harder to remove. And that has to do with the order that they're done. Instead of the floss kind of making a spiral through the fabric that's really kind of easy to pull out, it's kind of doubling back over on itself and adding a bunch of friction to itself. So a time when I would probably from now on choose to do English method is if I'm stitching on something practical. I've done a few stitches on clothing and on things that are actually going to be handled and used rather than just decorative. And in that circumstance, because those stitches were so much harder to remove, from now on, when I stitch on clothing or a towel or anything like that, I'm going to use the English method because I know those stitches will stay in better. Now, maybe you've been sitting here asking yourself, when's he going to tell us why it's called English method? I don't know. Just like with Danish method, I tapped all the resources that I had. I did a bunch of research. I tried to figure out if I could see why it was called English method, and I just couldn't find anything. It's possible that at the time that cross-stitching sort of swept across Europe in like the 15th century, there were sort of two different schools of it, and some came from Denmark and some came from England, but no one really knows. Hey, if you happen to be a fiber arts historian and you can answer that question for us, put it in the comments. I'd love to be able to pick your brain on that. So we've talked a bit about how the English method is done and why you might choose to do it. What about you? Do you employ it in any specific circumstance that maybe I didn't think of? Put it in the comments down below. Likewise, if you have a topic that you would like to see me cover on the channel in the future, put that in the comments as well, and I'll see if I can get around to it for you. Other than that, I do want to thank you so much for watching. For Caterpillar Cross Stitch, my name is Ford, and I will see you next week.